You know that feeling when you've been chasing your losses all week, refreshing your betting app every 5 minutes, watching the Premier League matches like your life depends on it, and then that final whistle blows and you realize you're down another 200 quid? Yeah, I've been there too. But here's the thing that kept nagging at me. Why do so many of us keep coming back to the Premier League when the odds there are absolutely decimated? Why do we keep throwing our money at the same well-traveled path when the real money, the serious money, the consistent money is being made elsewhere? That's the question that led me down a rabbit hole over the past few weeks, and what I discovered was so eye-opening that I had to sit down with some of the most successful bettors I know. Guys who've turned this from a hobby into a legitimate six-figure income, and get them to spill the beans. And let me tell you, they weren't shy about it. The consensus was almost unanimous, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. These pros, the ones who figured out how to beat the system, they're not spending their evenings poring over Manchester City lineup changes or arguing about whether Liverpool's defense is overrated this season. No, they've moved on. They've evolved. They've discovered something that the casual bettor, the guy who thinks he's smart because he watches all 3 matches on Boxing Day, hasn't quite figured out yet. And that something is going to change the way you think about sports betting forever, if you're willing to listen. Let me start by being completely honest with you. The Premier League is a trap. Not an obvious trap, not some kind of outright scam, but a carefully constructed, mathematically inevitable trap that's designed to separate you from your money. And the worst part? Everyone knows it's there. Every single person involved in the betting industry, the bookmakers, the sharp bettors, the syndicates, they all know it. But they also know that millions of people like you and me keep walking right into it, eyes wide open, thinking that this time will be different. This time we'll pick the winner. This time our analysis will be better than everyone else's. This time we'll beat the market. And every single time, we get humbled. Here's what one of the pros told me, and I want you to really sit with this because it's the fundamental truth that separates the winners from the perpetual losers in this game. He said, "The Premier League is the most efficient market in the world for sports betting." And when I say efficient, I mean the bookmakers have priced everything correctly. Think about that for a second. When something is priced correctly, that means there's no edge, no advantage, no hidden opportunity. It means that every bit of information available about Manchester United's chances of winning their next match has already been factored into the odds. The weather, the injuries, the form, the head-to-head record, the crowd atmosphere. It's all in there. So what's your advantage supposed to be? What are you bringing to the table that a room full of statisticians and algorithms hasn't already considered? The answer is probably nothing. But that's not the worst part. What really grinds my gears about the Premier League market is the juice. You know what I'm talking about. The vigorish, the vig, the commission that the bookmakers take from every bet. In the Premier League, that juice is absolutely brutal. We're talking anywhere from 3 to 5%, sometimes even more depending on where you're betting. That might sound small, but mathematically, it's devastating. Let me break this down for you, because this is where a lot of casual bettors don't do the math. If you're betting at odds of 1.95 on both sides of a market, which is pretty standard in the Premier League, the bookmaker has a built-in profit margin, and when you factor in all the bets across the market, they're taking their cut regardless of the outcome. You're not fighting against random chance. You're fighting against a mathematical certainty that's stacked against you. One of the guys I spoke with, a former professional trader who now focuses exclusively on betting, he told me about a specific example that really drove this home. He said he spent 3 years trying to beat the Premier League market. He had models, he had databases, he had connections within the industry. He knew when injuries were coming before they were official. He had relationships with people who could tip him off about potential line movements. And you know what his overall return was after 3 years of grinding? After spending literally thousands of hours on analysis? -12%. He was down money after fees and juice. That's when he realized something fundamental. The Premier League market isn't designed for people like him. It's designed to harvest money from people like us. The thing about the Premier League that most people don't realize is that it's become almost completely picked clean by sophisticated bettors. There are entire syndicates, groups of people with serious capital and serious technology, whose entire job is to find any inefficiency in Premier League pricing and exploit it in minutes. We're talking about milliseconds in some cases. They have algorithms that are comparing odds across every single sportsbook in the world simultaneously. The moment there's a discrepancy, they pounce. They'll place massive bets to correct the line, and by the time you even open your betting app, the line has already moved. You're seeing the same odds that 1,000 other people are seeing. There's no edge. There's no secret. You're just making a guess in a market where all the smart money has already made their move. And here's the psychological trap that really gets people. The Premier League is exciting. It's accessible. You watch it every week. You think you know the teams. You think you understand the dynamics. And because you're familiar with it, you feel like you should be able to make money on it. That's called the illusion of knowledge. And it's one of the most dangerous biases in betting. Just because you know something well doesn't mean you can profit from it. In fact, that familiarity might be working against you. You become overconfident. You think your analysis is special, but you're really just using the same publicly available information that every other bettor is using. I was talking to another pro. This guy runs a betting syndicate now, manages something like £2 million worth of action a year, and he told me that the Premier League represents less than 5% of their total betting volume. 5%. This is a guy who could bet on literally anything in the world, and he's only using 5% of his capital on the most popular, most watched, most analyzed league in professional football. When I asked him why he still bets the Premier League at all, he said it's basically just for fun. It's the only league where he's genuinely watching for entertainment value rather than profit potential. Everything else is business. The other thing that became crystal clear when I was talking to these pros is just how much the Premier League has changed in the last decade. Money has flooded into that league like never before. The broadcast rights are worth billions. Every single game is analyzed to death by multiple television networks, each with their own army of statisticians and analysts. The players are the best in the world, or at least the ones with the most market value get priced that way. And all of that means one thing: there is almost zero inefficiency left to exploit. Compare that to the situation 15 or 20 years ago, when you could actually find value in Premier League markets, and you'll realize that the game has fundamentally changed. One of the betting analysts I spoke with told me a story that really stuck with me. He said that back in 2005 he made a killing betting on the Premier League, not because he was a genius, but because the market was relatively unsophisticated. The bookmakers didn't have the data that they have now. The sharp bettors hadn't congregated and built the massive syndicates that exist today. You could find value. You could make money. And this guy did. He made enough money to basically fund the rest of his betting career. But he also said something important. That's not your market anymore. That market doesn't exist. And he's right. The Premier League of 2025 is not the Premier League that created millionaires out of sharp bettors. Now here's where the conversation started getting really interesting. Once I understood why the Premier League was such a trap, I asked the obvious follow-up question. Okay, so where are you making your money? And that's when they all started talking about the same thing. The obscure leagues, the lower divisions, the leagues that nobody's heard of, the matches where the Curaçao League is playing the San Marino Cup or whatever, the Bulgarian third division, the Portuguese second tier, the Romanian first division in the middle of the week when nobody's watching. These are the places where the real money is being made. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hold on, how am I supposed to find an edge in a league where I don't even know who the players are? That's a fair question. That's the first question I asked too. But here's the thing. That's exactly why these leagues are profitable. The very fact that you don't know who the players are, that you can't just turn on the television and watch the match live, that you have to go out of your way to find information, that's not a bug, it's a feature. That's the entire reason why obscure leagues are where the money is. Let me explain the mechanics of this, because it's actually brilliant if you think about it. When you're betting on the Premier League, you're competing against millions of other bettors and hundreds of millions in total wagered volume. The bookmakers are incredibly sharp because they have to be. The market punishes them instantly if their odds are off. But when you're betting on the Bulgarian third division or the Romanian Cup competition, What's the total volume of money being wagered? We're talking hundreds of thousands at most, sometimes less. The bookmakers don't have the same incentive to be perfectly sharp in these markets. Why would they? The amount of money they'd have to invest in analysis to get their odds exactly right might not be worth it compared to the volume. So they set odds based on broader principles and historical data, and that creates opportunities. One of the syndicates I spoke with, they specifically focus on Eastern European football. And I mean Eastern European football at every level, the top leagues, the second divisions, the cup competitions, everything. They have a team of people who watch those matches, who keep databases of how teams perform, who understand the dynamics of those leagues in ways that Western bookmakers never will. And because of that edge, because they understand something that the market doesn't fully price in, they make money, consistent money. This guy told me that their worst month in the last 2 years was a loss of £8,000. Their best month was a profit of £140,000. We're talking about a monthly average return that would make most professional investors blush. But here's what really got me excited about this. He said something that completely changed my perspective. He said, the beautiful thing about these leagues is that you don't need to be smarter than everyone else. You just need to be smarter than the market. And that's a completely different proposition. You don't need to beat the algorithm. You don't need to find some secret that all the professional syndicates have missed. You just need to find something that the bookmakers haven't bothered to price in because the total volume doesn't justify the effort. That's so much more achievable. Let me give you a specific example that one of the pros shared with me. There's a team in the Turkish second division, and I'm not going to name them because this guy still bets on them, and I'm not trying to blow up his spot. But here's the situation. This team has this one midfielder who's been with them for about 5 years. Local kid, came up through their academy, knows the system inside and out, and whenever this guy plays, the team's performance is markedly different than when he doesn't. It's subtle enough that most casual observers wouldn't notice. But it's there. The bookmakers are pricing the team the same way regardless. Meanwhile, this syndicate has flagged it. They know exactly when this midfielder is playing and when he's not, and they bet accordingly. Over the course of a season, that one piece of information, which is publicly available, by the way, it's not like they're getting insider information, that one thing creates a significant edge. The thing about obscure leagues is that they're genuinely difficult to analyze. That's the point. That's the entire advantage. When you're looking at the Portuguese second division, you need to understand not just how teams play, but the financial situation of the clubs, the managerial philosophies, the structure of the league itself. You need to know that when a team plays their 4th match in 10 days, their performance profile changes. You need to know which clubs are well organized at the back and which ones leak goals. You need to understand referee bias in certain leagues, and let me tell you, referee bias in obscure leagues is very real. Some referees are consistently more lenient in certain divisions. That's the kind of information that's not going to show up in an algorithm. Another guy I spoke with, he focuses on Scandinavian football, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish leagues at various levels, and he told me that he's made more money in the last 3 years betting on Norwegian third division matches than he made in the previous 10 years betting on Premier League and Champions League matches combined. His entire strategy is built on understanding one thing: fixture congestion and player fatigue in those specific leagues. In Norwegian football, the season is compressed. Teams play more matches in a shorter period of time than they do in most other European leagues. And because of that compression, there are specific periods where certain teams' performances drop off sharply. He knows exactly when those periods are going to occur. He knows which teams handle fixture congestion better than others. He knows which managers rotate their squad and which ones don't. And because he understands those specific dynamics of the Norwegian league in ways that bookmakers simply don't prioritize, he has an edge. The first time I heard about these opportunities, I was skeptical. I mean, genuinely skeptical. I thought, okay, so you're telling me I should spend my time researching some league that nobody watches so I can find edges that nobody else cares about? It sounded insane. It sounded like the opposite of what you're supposed to do in betting, which is to focus on the popular leagues where all the smart money is. But then I started thinking about it from an economic perspective. Markets are inefficient when there's insufficient information or when the potential profit isn't worth the cost of obtaining the information. In the Premier League, there are thousands of smart people already doing the work. In the Romanian second division, there might be 5 people who are seriously analyzing matches. When you have that kind of disparity in competition, you can actually create an edge. One of the more fascinating conversations I had was with a guy who specifically focuses on South American football, Brazilian Serie B, Colombian Second Division, that kind of thing. And he made a point that really struck me. He said, the thing that nobody realizes is that South American football, especially at the lower levels, it's incredibly predictable in certain ways. And I asked him what he meant. He said that the quality disparity between teams is often massive. Like, we're talking about a situation where one team might be genuinely professional and well organized, and their opponents might be semi-professional. The difference in quality is enormous. But the bookmakers don't always price that in accurately because they're working with limited data and they're trying to set odds that will attract betting on both sides of the match. So you get situations where a team that's vastly superior is underpriced relative to their actual advantage. He gave me a specific example. There was a match in the Brazilian second division, and one team was priced at around 1.8 odds to win. This team, by this guy's analysis, should have been priced at around 1.4 or 1.5. They were genuinely that much better than their opponent. The bookmakers' odds implied a roughly 45% probability of this team winning, but based on the actual quality disparity, the team should have been favored at something like 60 to 65%. So he bet heavily on the favorite. The team won 4-1, and because he'd identified something that the market hadn't fully priced in, he made a killing on that bet. Now here's the thing that separates the successful bettors from the ones who just get lucky. They don't bet on random matches in obscure leagues. They don't just throw darts at a board and hope something sticks. They build systems. They develop specific criteria for when they're going to bet and when they're not. They understand their edge in precise terms. One of the syndicate managers I spoke with told me that they probably analyze 10,000 matches per year across various obscure leagues, but they only actually bet on maybe 300 of them. That's a 3% bet rate. They're incredibly selective because they only want to bet when they've identified a genuine edge, not just when they have an opinion about the match. The interesting thing about that approach is that it's actually the opposite of what casual bettors do. Casual bettors see a match and think, yeah, I think this team is going to win, and they place a bet. Professional bettors look at thousands of matches and wait for the specific ones where they've identified something that the market hasn't priced in. It's a completely different mindset. It's the difference between playing poker as a casual game, where you play every hand, and playing poker professionally, where you fold 90% of the time and only play when you have an edge. One of the guys I spoke with actually gave me access to some of his data, anonymized, of course, and the results were absolutely stunning. Over a 3-year period, betting exclusively on obscure Eastern European and Scandinavian leagues, his unit profit was 38.7%. That means that for every unit he wagered, went one man, $1, whatever, he made a profit of 0.387 units. Over the course of a year, if he's wagering £100,000, that's a profit of £38,700. For context, that's a return that most professional investors would kill for. And this guy's doing it on football matches in Bulgaria and Serbia. But here's where I need to be honest with you about the difficulties. These leagues are genuinely hard to follow. You can't just watch them on Sky Sports. You need to find streams, you need to keep your own databases, you need to develop relationships with people who understand those leagues. You need to understand language barriers when you're trying to research teams and players. It's work, and that's actually kind of the point. The easier it is to access information about a league, the more people are analyzing it, the more efficient the market becomes. The harder it is to access information, the less competition you have for finding edges. This is where a lot of people make their first mistake when they try to get into betting obscure leagues. They think they can just go on the internet, watch a few YouTube highlights of some Turkish team, and suddenly they're going to have an edge. That's not how it works. You need to actually commit to understanding the leagues. You need to watch matches, real matches, not highlights. You need to understand team dynamics. You need to know that Team A plays a high-pressing system under their new manager, and that changes how they're going to perform against teams that like to build from the back. You need to know that the midfielder we talked about earlier is crucial to their system. One of the more successful bettors I spoke with, he told me that he basically dedicates his life to understanding the Romanian Football League. That's his league of choice. He watches every single match. He has notebooks filled with information about team patterns, player development, manager tendencies. He knows it inside and out. And because of that deep knowledge, he has an edge that nobody else in the market has. When a Romanian club is underpriced because they had an unlucky result the week before, he knows it. When a team is overpriced because they just won but it was against a terrible opponent, he knows that too. His deep knowledge gives him an advantage in pricing. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it's actually available to anyone who's willing to put in the work. You don't need to be smarter than everyone else. You don't need to have some secret algorithm or some insider information. You just need to pick a league that you can realistically develop genuine expertise in, and then actually do the work to develop that expertise. One guy I spoke with, he's a school teacher who bets on the Dutch second division in his spare time. He's turned a £2,000 initial bankroll into just over £150,000 in 5 years. He's not a savant. He's not some mathematical genius. He's just a guy who decided to become an expert in something obscure, and that expertise has been incredibly profitable. Now, one thing that all the successful bettors mentioned is that you need to be incredibly disciplined about when you actually place bets. This is where emotional betting kills people. You might watch a match in some obscure league, have a strong opinion about it, and feel compelled to bet on it, but if it doesn't fit your system, if you don't have a genuine edge based on the analysis you've done, you need to pass. This is hard for casual bettors because there's always action happening somewhere. There's always a match to bet on. But the pros understand that saying no to a bet is just as important as saying yes to one. One of the guys told me about a period where he went 3 weeks without placing a single bet because he couldn't find matches that fit his criteria. 3 weeks. For most casual bettors, that would be unbearable, but for him, it made perfect sense, because he understands that betting when you don't have an edge is just gambling. And the goal is not to gamble, it's to make money. There's a crucial difference. And here's another thing that really surprised me when I was doing these conversations. The bookmakers know all this stuff. They understand that the Premier League is efficient. They understand that the edges are in the obscure leagues. And do you know what they do about it? Absolutely nothing in many cases. Why? Because the volume on Premier League betting is so enormous that they can afford to have a lower margin. They'll take a 1 or 2% edge on every Premier League bet because there's millions of pounds flowing in. But on obscure leagues, they're willing to have a higher margin because the volume is so much lower. It's a completely rational business decision. They're not trying to beat you on the obscure leagues. They're just trying to make sure they don't lose money on them. But here's the thing, just because they're willing to maintain a higher margin doesn't mean the market is inefficient. It just means the juice is higher. And one of the pros I spoke with, he actually factors that into his analysis. He said that a higher VIG is worth paying if the edge is large enough. So if he's identified a situation where a team should be priced at 1.5, but they're actually 1.65, that higher VIG is worth it because the underlying edge is so large. But if the situation is only marginal, if he's looking at a situation where the difference is small, then the higher VIG makes it not worth betting. This brings me to something really important that I think a lot of casual bettors don't understand. Bet sizing. Once you've identified an edge, you need to bet an amount that's proportional to that edge. This is where Kelly criterion comes in. But I'm not going to get too deep into the mathematics, because it's not necessary. The basic principle is this: the larger your edge, the larger the bet you can justify making. If you've identified an edge where you think a team that's priced at 1.5 should actually be priced at 1.35, that's a small edge, maybe 2%. you need to be careful with your bet sizing. But if you've identified a situation where a team that's priced at 2 should be priced at 1.4, that's a massive edge, maybe 30%. You can and should be much more aggressive with your bet sizing. The problem is that most casual bettors do the exact opposite. They bet huge amounts on matches where they have weak opinions, and they bet tiny amounts on matches where they've done serious analysis and have strong opinions. It's completely backwards, and that's actually a very common reason why people lose money betting. It's not necessarily that their analysis is bad, it's that their bet sizing is terrible. One of the syndicate managers told me about a time when one of his team members made a huge bet on what they'd identified as a very solid edge. The bet hit, and the guy won around £30,000. But here's the thing, the manager wasn't happy. Why? Because the bet size was too large relative to the confidence level. Even though it won, it was the wrong bet to make in terms of risk management. If it had lost, the team would have suffered a significant drawdown. And in betting, just like in any investment strategy, avoiding catastrophic losses is sometimes more important than maximizing gains. This is a lesson that I think is absolutely crucial for anyone who wants to make money from betting. It's not just about finding edges, it's about managing those edges properly. It's about understanding your bankroll and making sure that even if you have a series of losses, you're not going to go bust. A lot of casual bettors don't think about this. They don't have a system. They don't have a bankroll management strategy. They just bet based on how much money they have at any given time. And that's essentially a guaranteed way to lose money in the long run. Let me tell you about something that really struck me when I was talking to these pros: survivorship bias. Most of the really successful bettors have experienced serious losses at some point. They've had periods where they were down significantly and had to claw their way back. One guy I spoke with, he told me that he lost 30% of his bankroll in a single month when he was starting out. He was devastated. He thought his system was broken. But he stuck with it, he refined his approach, and within 2 years, he'd not only made back those losses, but had grown his bankroll to more than 10 times what it was before. The point is that losing is part of the process. It's part of the game. But here's what separates the guys who make it from the guys who don't. They don't overreact to short-term results. They understand that betting, especially in markets where you have a real edge, is about the long term. 1 month of losses doesn't mean your system is broken. It might mean that you've run into some bad variance. Bad variance is real. It happens. Even if you have a significant edge, you can have periods where the results don't go your way. The professionals know this. They understand that their edge will play out over time, but in the short term, anything can happen. This is why bankroll management is so crucial. If you only have enough money to weather a bad month before you run out of funds, you're not going to survive long enough for your edge to play out. But if you have enough bankroll to withstand extended losing periods, then you can actually benefit from your edge over time. One of the guys I spoke with, he maintains a bankroll that's large enough that even if he experiences a 50% drawdown, he can still function and continue betting. That's the kind of risk management that allows people to be professional bettors. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in the betting world: the importance of tracking your results. One of the syndicates I spoke with, they track every single bet they make. They know their win rate, their average odds, their unit profit, their ROI. They know exactly how much money they've made in specific categories of bets. They use this data to continuously refine their approach. If they notice that they're particularly profitable when betting on Tuesday matches in the Cypriot League, but losing money on Sundays, they'll adjust their focus accordingly. This obsessive attention to data is what separates professionals from amateurs. Most casual bettors don't track anything. They might remember their big wins, but forget about most of their losses. That's the human memory playing tricks on you. It's called the memory bias, and it's one of the reasons why so many people think they're better at betting than they actually are. They overestimate their wins and underestimate their losses. If you're serious about making money from betting, you need to track everything meticulously. Here's something else that came up repeatedly in my conversations: the importance of line shopping. Different bookmakers set odds slightly differently, especially for obscure leagues where the volume is lower and the sharpness is less fine-tuned. You can sometimes find significant differences in the odds offered by different books. That might be a difference of 0.05 in decimal odds, which sounds tiny, but over the course of hundreds or thousands of bets, that compounds into significant money. One of the pros I spoke with, he uses around 15 different sports books, specifically because he wants to be able to shop for the best lines. He's always betting with the book that offers the best odds for what he wants to bet on. The thing about line shopping is that it requires discipline and organization. You need to be checking odds across multiple books simultaneously. You need to be fast because good lines move quickly, and you need to know which books offer the best odds for specific types of bets. It's not glamorous work, but it's the kind of work that separates the professional bettors from everyone else. I also learned something really interesting about the life cycle of betting edges. When an edge first emerges, when a market first becomes mispriced in some way, it can be absolutely massive. The guy who discovered it can make serious money. But then other bettors start to notice. They start betting on it too. The line moves, the edge shrinks. Eventually, it might disappear entirely. This is why successful bettors are constantly looking for new edges. They understand that any given edge has a lifespan. You need to exploit it while it's there, but you also need to be constantly seeking new inefficiencies to exploit. This is actually one of the reasons why betting on obscure leagues remains profitable. The market for obscure leagues is small enough that there aren't that many people looking for edges. So when an edge does emerge, it can take a while for the market to fully correct. In the Premier League, an edge might be arbitraged away in hours. In the Bulgarian second division, it might stick around for weeks or even months. One of the most interesting things I learned was about the concept of trading bets. Most casual bettors place a bet and then just watch it play out until the end of the match. But professional bettors sometimes trade their bets, essentially placing a counter bet to reduce their exposure or lock in profit. For example, if you've bet on a team to win at 2 odds and they go up a goal, you might be able to place a live bet on the opponent at better odds than you initially expected. By trading out, you can reduce your risk while maintaining upside potential. This is something that requires significant skill and discipline, but it's another tool in the professional bettor's arsenal. Let me tell you about something that really intrigued me. The concept of underbetting your edge. One of the syndicates I spoke with, they actually deliberately bet less than the Kelly criterion would suggest they should. Why? Because they want to avoid moving the line too much. If they're betting massive amounts on a particular outcome, other bookmakers and syndicates will notice the move in the line, and they'll start investigating why. That investigation might lead them to discover the same edge. But if you're betting more modestly, you can exploit the edge without drawing attention to it. This is something that only happens when you have significant volume, but it shows the kind of sophisticated thinking that goes into professional betting. The other thing about betting on obscure leagues that I think is really important to mention is the mental side of it. When you're betting on matches that nobody else is watching, in a league that nobody else is following, it can feel a bit isolating. You're making decisions that go against the grain of what everyone else is doing. Most people are betting on the Premier League and Champions League. You're betting on the Bulgarian third division. That requires a certain amount of psychological resilience. You need to trust your analysis even when nobody else is validating it. You need to believe in your edge even when you're in a losing streak and everyone on the internet is telling you that you're crazy. One of the guys I spoke with, he told me that this mental aspect is actually what separates the winners from the losers more than anything else. The analytical skills are teachable. The discipline around bet sizing and bankroll management can be learned. But the psychological fortitude to make contrarian bets and stick with them when everyone else is doing something different, that's something that not everyone has. Here's something that I think a lot of people don't realize about betting on obscure leagues. The community aspect. Because the betting market is smaller, you often develop relationships with other bettors who are focused on the same leagues. You exchange information, you discuss matches, you help each other develop your systems. One of the bettors I spoke with, He's part of a small group chat with about 8 other people who all focus on Eastern European football. They share ideas, they discuss matches, they help each other spot opportunities. It's a community in a way, and that community aspect actually helps everyone perform better. And then at the end of all the games, the winners actually win. They win because they took. Now, I want to address something that I think is really important: the risks of betting on obscure leagues. One of the main risks is integrity. In lower leagues, especially in developing countries, match fixing can be a real issue. Not all the time and not in all places, but it's definitely something you need to be aware of. A match that should be a clear favorite inexplicably loses because the result was fixed. It happens. Professional bettors who focus on obscure leagues are very aware of this risk, and they often have ways of identifying suspicious matches. But it's definitely a risk that casual bettors might not be anticipating. Another risk is just the general unpredictability of obscure leagues. In the Premier League, you generally know what to expect. The matches are high quality, the players are committed, the competition is fierce. In some of the more obscure leagues, especially in developing countries, the level of professionalism can be inconsistent. A team might field a completely different roster in a cup match than they do in the league. Player injuries might not be well documented. Teams might have financial issues that lead to sudden departures of key players. All of this creates additional unpredictability that you need to account for. One of the bettors I spoke with told me that he avoids betting on certain leagues specifically because he thinks the risks outweigh the opportunities. He said that a couple of specific African leagues just have too many integrity issues for him to be comfortable betting on them. That's the kind of judgment that professional bettors need to make. They need to assess whether the potential profit is worth the additional risk. This brings me to something really important: research. And I mean serious, dedicated research. If you're going to bet on the Romanian second division, you need to actually understand Romanian football. You need to know the teams, the players, the managers, the history of the league. You can't just read some quick summary on Wikipedia and think you have enough information to make decisions. That's a recipe for losing money. One of the most successful bettors I spoke with, when I asked him how much time he spends on research, he told me that it varies, but that he probably spends at least 3 to 4 hours per day on research and match analysis. That's a full-time job. And the thing is, he's still learning. Even after being focused on Eastern European football for over a decade, he still discovers new things regularly. He still adjusts his models. He still finds new inefficiencies to exploit. That's the level of commitment that this requires. The good news is that you don't need to commit to this full-time to see results. Even if you're just doing it as a side project in your spare time, you can develop a real edge if you're willing to be disciplined and systematic about it. But you do need to take it seriously. You can't just dabble in it casually and expect to make money. It's like any other skill. The more you put in, the more you get out. Let me tell you about the power of specialization. I spoke with a guy who focuses exclusively on Italian football. Not just Serie A, but Serie B, Serie C, the Coppa Italia at all levels. His entire world is Italian football. And because of that complete focus, he has developed an understanding of Italian football that's basically unmatched in the betting market. He knows the history of every club, the management structures, the financial situations, the playing philosophies. He knows things about certain teams that very few people outside of Italy know. And that incredibly deep specialization has made him seriously wealthy from betting. The lesson here is that if you want to develop an edge, you probably need to go deep rather than broad. It's tempting to bet on lots of different leagues and lots of different sports, but you're more likely to be successful if you pick something and become genuinely expert in it. Pick a league that interests you, that you can realistically follow closely, and then dedicate yourself to becoming the best analyst of that league that you can be. Now, one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that the professionals I spoke with don't talk about this publicly very often. Why? Because if this information got widely distributed, it would change the market. If thousands of casual bettors suddenly decided to focus on the Romanian second division or the Cypriot first division, that market would become more efficient. the edges would shrink, the opportunities would dry up. So the fact that I'm sharing this with you is kind of a big deal. These guys were willing to talk to me because they understand that this information isn't going to fundamentally change the market. Most people aren't going to do the work required to develop a real edge. Most people aren't going to commit to understanding an obscure league deeply enough to make money from it consistently. Most people are still going to try to make quick money betting on the Premier League, and that's fine. For the professional bettors anyway. But here's what I want you to understand. If you are willing to put in the work, if you're willing to commit to understanding a market deeply, if you're willing to be disciplined about your approach and systematic about your analysis, then you genuinely can make money from betting. Not just small amounts, serious, substantial money. Money that could be life-changing if you're smart about bankroll management and risk control. One of the guys I spoke with, he told me something that really stuck with me. He said, the best edge you can have in betting isn't information, it's perspective. It's understanding something about how a market works that the rest of the market hasn't figured out yet. And that's what the professionals have. They understand something about how markets work, how leagues work, how teams perform under specific circumstances, and they've built systems around that understanding. They've validated their systems through data, they've refined them continuously, and they've turned that understanding into consistent profitability. So here's my takeaway from all of this. Stop betting on the Premier League unless you're just doing it for fun. If you're trying to make money, you're essentially competing against the most sophisticated betting market in the world. You're going up against algorithms and syndicates with massive capital. The odds are literally stacked against you. But if you're willing to focus on an obscure league that not many people are paying attention to, if you're willing to develop genuine expertise in that league, if you're willing to be disciplined about when you place bets and how much you stake, then you can actually create a real edge. You can actually make money consistently. The betting industry doesn't want you to know this stuff. The bookmakers certainly don't want you to know this stuff. They'd much rather have you betting mindlessly on the Premier League, playing the role of the mark in a rigged game. But now you know. You know that there's a better way. You know that obscure leagues represent genuine opportunities for people who are willing to do the work. The question now is, are you willing to do that work? Are you willing to be contrarian and bet on matches that nobody else is watching? If the answer is yes, then you've just discovered a real opportunity to make money from betting. The choice is yours, but now you know the truth. Now you know where the real money is being made. The rest is up to you.